Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Train the Mind by NeuroSmart podcast, where we will discuss effective tools and techniques that prepare the mind for optimal performance under stress. My name is Melis Yilmaz Balban. I'm the CEO and founder of NeuroSmart, where we develop self-regulation training designed for law enforcement, military officers, and athletics. Today, our guest is Jesse Curtis. Jesse is the Deputy Director of Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy. He is responsible for the design, development, implementation, and evaluation of all basic and advanced curricula. He has been a full-time trainer at WLEA since March of 2013, primarily specializing in defensive tactics, use of force, search and seizure. He has 9 years of civilian and law enforcement experience and 4 years of experience in the U.S. Marine Corps. During the time, he served in a variety of capacities, including as a defensive tactics instructor, drug recognition expert, SWAT operator, and DEA task force officer. He has been a consistent practitioner of martial arts and combat arts since 1993 and has been a Phase 1 instructor in the concepts of Jeet Kune Do since 2017 under Sufi John Koshal. Hope I didn't butcher that name. Welcome, Jesse. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good to see you. So I was just looking at my notes from 2023 when we first met. And you had mentioned that when you first started your role at the Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy as a trainer, you saw a huge diminishment in cognition when the officers were getting maybe emotional or stressed, and that what you were training was not applying in real life. You did not see what you trained. Those are your words. You did not see what you trained. So can you talk a little bit about what problems you encountered in officers' performance when you first joined as a trainer?
Yeah. So the primary purpose I had in coming up here, the reason I was hired was as a defensive tactics instructor, and I ended up leading that program within a couple months of arriving here. One of the first instances we saw of that was the training program was, as many of them are, very static in nature, very technique oriented. The focus of the training was to be able to do the technique well. So to do that, it was a static environment. And then we would have an activity at the end of that training, about 60 hours of training that was very dynamic and unpredictable. Officers didn't know what they were getting into. It was scenario-driven, scenario-based activity, and there was no translation. There was no transfer going on. We wouldn't see the things we trained. And so over a relatively short period of time, a few instances of this, I began seeing if officers actually forgot, didn't know, couldn't do anymore. And this is a relatively close time span as well. And immediately after the activity, once we were out of the activity, these folks could do the thing. They could do the technique, right? There wasn't a diminished performance really until you enter into the activity, and there was a huge one. So that's what started this journey as to figure out what the problem was. The initial assumption was that they just had not had enough repetitions, and so therefore it wasn't, I'll use the term lightly, deep enough in the brain. That's not what was wrong, but that was the idea. So I started off looking at how many repetitions are needed in order for it to be in long-term memory enough that they could do it. Turns out that was absolutely the wrong question and a very ignorant question. So, but that's what started all this. We would see that in other aspects of training as well, near the end of a basic training, where officers, when these things were put together, integrated together, that the performance would decline markedly. And usually you would see a shift, that you would see people making decisions, for instance, but they couldn't execute them well, or the decisions themselves were completely lacking, but they did decide to do something and execute it. And so typically you would see either a cognitive type focus or a more of a psychomotor type focus. And it was pretty clear that those two weren't combined. They weren't working together They just abandoned one for the other. So that's what started this several years ago.
Just to clarify, thank you. So you talked about techniques being taught in isolation in a static environment and then put together in the activity. Can you talk about these different techniques or these firearms, like what being taught in isolation? You did talk about the separation of cognitive versus psychomotor skills. So what kind of techniques are these?
The skills that we were dealing with at the time with regard to the activity I just talked about were defensive tactics. So arm bars and shoulder locks, and even basic things like punches and blocks, and what we called parries at the time. Various ground techniques, how to manage a physical conflict on the ground. Those kinds of skills. We did not train them as well. We train them as what I call a skill progression. So it would start with something that happened, and then you would go through a progression of skills linked together, serial skills linked together, that would end in the officer establishing some sort of position of control. So that was the way it was trained during training, and obviously in the activity, that's not how those things would work out. So there were several disconnects between the training and the activity. But we found the same thing when we would talk about things like traffic stops. Firearms is one of those really interesting aspects, in that it's probably the most difficult to create a skill generalization out of, because you're dealing with bullets. And so when you take the bullet out of the equation, then the potential of the emotional impact changes completely. And there's other technologies one can use, but and we do use, but that's been the field or the skill set that we have changed the least so far, just because of the safety parameters involved and some of the difficulties with that. But it primarily started with the defensive tactics, with the fighting types of things. And again, there was just not the transfer, and pretty quickly we noticed that the environment had a lot to do with that. So that led to a lot of searching out of, well, what's different between the environment that they need to perform in and the environment that they're training in, and what of those things can be transferred. What skill sets are missing. One of the things that we now know is, if you separate the cognitive knowledge and the physical skill set, the decisions, with the physical skills, that you shouldn't expect them to be making those decisions and executing those skills, that there even needs to be an integration with the cognitive pieces, the recognition and the decisions, with the execution of the skill, that they don't just naturally come together, at least not very often. So and again, we weren't doing anything any different than most other academies still do, with really isolating out cognitive pieces and physical skill pieces, and making everything very isolated, and then doing activities where they're supposed to just come together
magically.
And they don't.
So with the cognitive piece and decision-making piece, can you tell us about the types of decisions that the officers need to make for the defensive tactic training, like using what type of force, for example? That's the type of
there's three basic components of decision, so to speak. Well, in theory, there's actually four in training, but the three that we're trying to get to by the end of training is there's a legal component. What is reasonable from a legal perspective? There's an interactive component that often gets overlooked, that when I'm interacting with another human being, there's a whole series of decisions just in basic communication that have to be made. And that's why a lot of times you'll see in dynamic activities, officers can't talk anymore, or their talk is, they're giving commands, but the commands are, it's not an interaction anymore. So because we're missing that piece. And then there's the operational components, which are strategic in the performance. What should I do?
Yes.
And in training, there's a phase of that training for sure, where the mechanics of how to do the thing is also in play, which at that time requires a set of decisions as well. That
Yeah. Yes.
So if we want to be functional at the physical skill, then one of the goals of training is to be able to not be cognitive about the mechanics, not be internally focused, not be cognitive about the mechanics of the skill, but rather be more externally focused and what should I do, and when should I do it, not how should I get it done.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I mean, all these skills I always emphasize are such complex cognitive skills that require, a lot of brain power, for the lack of a word. But like, for example, the legal aspect is basically remembering, right? It's pure knowledge in what's legal, what's not, and what's in your authority to do at that point is pulling information from your long-term memory. Interactive component is pretty the social aspect, and also short-term memory. You need to pay attention what the person is saying, and pay attention to their body language in order to respond. And then the operational component is a bit of both, right? So you have your knowledge, but you also need to assess the situation. So the situational awareness piece comes in, the sensory awareness comes in. What else is in the environment? Do I have cover? Do I have not cover? So all these things go into that decision. So very complicated decision making going on, which we know that stress influences all of these pieces. And so it's no surprise, of course, when you add the stress component in an activity, or more of a realistic scenario, that all of these get diminished, and the skills, and you end up with something completely different. So you noticed this, and you decided to implement some changes. I have it in my notes. You spent 2 years developing new training. So tell us a little bit about the changes that you implemented.
Well, it was progressive. For some reason, they wouldn't send me to school for 8 years to learn this stuff. So we would learn some things, and we were learning from the perspective of application. We were trying to solve present problems in training, and so it was kind of a backwards approach that way. But and so we would learn something. For instance, one of the first things that we learned from a physical skills standpoint that completely turned training upside down was the idea of schema and schema development, adaptation. Yeah, how do you make novel adaptations to a physical skill? Learning that in almost everything that we do, that there isn't a simple transfer of learning, as Dr. Schmidt would talk about, because we can't mimic environments. We can't mimic the live environment with the training environment. And a lot of people that I talk to even still misunderstand what that means. We can create what looks like a live environment.
Right.
But
not in the person's brain.
Right. And that environment will not exist again in the live environment. And so if we're wanting to actually train adaptation, we have to have variability in the environment, and really pick on or be intentional about what the variables are that change. So the focus becomes training adaptation in the physical skills realm. The initial focus, and we've since added to this, but the initial focus was purely so that we could have a functional physical skill. So they've practiced shooting the basketball at different distances and different angles to the basket, not just at one place, and then assuming that they can shoot from anywhere on the court. That's one of the analogies I use all the time. So how do you do that in the context of an arm bar and a shoulder lock and strikes? And so that's what brought us initially to this idea of teaching a concept, and then making them adapt it, which is the reverse of what we expected in the old training model, where we would teach them a variety of applications and presume that they could conceptualize that, which also
generalizing.
That doesn't happen well, at least not in the time frames. That's what a well-experienced officer has done on their own over time, over a period of years. But that becomes pretty counterproductive for us if we expect that after 12 weeks or even after a year, quite frankly, with a lot of this stuff. So the question became is can we just teach the concept? And there's really not a big body of research that I could find that talked about this issue a whole lot by itself. But there was nothing that said that we couldn't. We started doing that and then putting them in the environments. Well, as Dr. Schmidt would talk about variant versus invariant features of the skill, we had to make sure the invariant features were there. And as soon as we did, we would start putting them in variable environments, which is contrary to traditional training, which says you got to master the skill in a static environment.
I love that. I love that. I just want to underline the concept of training for adaptation instead of in training for scenario. And I think one thing that really here I think makes sense is also presenting training in that way and setting your expectations. You're not expecting them to do this or that, right? Like you don't have a set outcome. This is what you should do in this scenario, if I'm understanding right. But instead, the expectation is adaptation. You expect them to adapt as variables change. And when you set it like that, I think it also in the brain, like if you think about it, how information is stored, it's always about the purpose of the training. So if the recruits are, expected to perform in a particular way, that's what they're going to do. Correct. And that's what they're going to learn. And that's what they're going to integrate, like the environmental cues with that scenario. But in the real life, no scenario will match that. Of course, there's always be variability. And so then, because the expectation is not adaptability in most training settings or academies still, then they don't know what to do, essentially. And it's very difficult to retrieve and contextualize that information. It's impossible. I mean, some people can do it maybe naturally, but it's impossible, especially put stress under it. And you have less cognitive resources. If you're not regulating your stress, then it's just bound to fail. So you're training for adaptation. You're including variables, variant and invariant features into the scenario. Can you walk us through an example of what that looks like in a scenario?
In the beginning of training, one of the first challenges was how do you incorporate things that don't overwhelm but are incorporating elements of the environment, and so that's where we initially developed this structure of okay, they got to be able to recognize things, they've got to be able to make decisions, they've got to be able to adapt and transition. And the emotional component of they've got to be able to, as the emotion changes, they've got to be able to regulate those things simultaneously. And so it starts with what we call drills. And so we don't even start with scenarios. We start with drills, but there's variability defined in the drill. So for instance, something as simple as somebody throwing a punch. What we would teach traditionally, and what they still teach in a lot of places, both in law enforcement and martial arts, is how you respond to that is dependent upon how they're striking, right? You got 18 different blocks or 18 different punches. We don't do that. We teach what it is conceptually to deal with that thing coming at you. Right? We teach that. That's explicit. And then we put them in the environment in the drill where it may be one or two of those variations, but they have to deal with those things. We also put that in a continuous format. That's why we call it a drill. That's for retention purposes, right? Riding the bike theory. But it also helps promote some more of the environmental context, right? That it's not just start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. We're actually in this continuous conflict kind of mode. And then what you do is you start adding branches to that, adding variability to that. Okay, so you've dealt with the thing. Now what's the next thing what are you trying to get to? What's the outcomes that you're trying to get to? So okay, you're in a position of advantage. Okay, what can we do from here? And we'll start with a thing to create a measure of control. And that usually is a level change, getting them on the ground. And then you have the same thing going on the ground. You're here. What are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to get to? But we teach those things conceptually. so that the student is required to adapt and not try to perfect a technique, not try to perfect a process. And what I found, two of the things I found very striking, and words matter a lot in teaching. If I give a student a process and I'm very technical in the teaching of a technique, I can talk to them about concepts all day long and they will absolutely ignore it, because it's so much easier just to try to mirror a technique. If I don't give that to them and I give them an understanding of a concept first, then I'll actually try to elicit out of them the technique later, verbally, and they'll do it because they've had to adapt. They discover various aspects of that technique. And that's the hard part. That's the hard part for trainers is most of us were not trained that way.
Right.
So how would you train somebody else that way? It's so much easier to say, wow, that is horrible. The only good part of that is right before we started. So we need to clean this up, right? And there's this taking over, and as soon as you do that, you've created, and that's the second part of this, you've created a condition of dependency where that student will now come to you.
Yeah.
And they're no longer making decisions, they're asking for the answers. And that's at least with what we do, that is extremely detrimental, because that's not what they get to do in the work environment.
Yes.
So we start with these little drills that seemingly, we call them training methods, not fighting methods if you're on the mat, because it looks goofy, but it's all built to create a condition of variability in a continuous environment. And then you can start adding complexity to that variability. That goofy little, we call it a pressure drill or energy drill we start with, is literally just a framework. And out of that, by the time we're done with the program, any skill that we've trained and any potential attack that we've trained, all is incorporated into that. And the students can literally decide and even the defining of roles. We don't say you're the bad guy, you're the officer. We say, start the drill. One of you gets to attack and one of you gets to respond, and that goes back and forth. And it's very asymmetrical that way. And that's a very good thing. It's a very good way to train, because that is one of the aspects of fighting that is so difficult to deal with is it's asymmetrical. It's just not, it's not a very nice pattern. It's like a very horrible song. It's not played well. Things aren't right. There's no choreography involved in it. And so how do you go from that? And that, I think, is, in my opinion, is the key. Is you start with what that live environment looks like and what the performance looks like in the live environment, and you work backwards to say, okay, well, what skill sets, what attributes do they need in order to be able to do those things? And that's where we really started discovering that these folks aren't making any decisions. Well, no wonder they're not using anything. They're not even recognizing. We've not conditioned a behavior to even recognize, let alone make a decision based on that recognition. And then even if you could do that, if you're training in a strict technique format, well, great, you've made the decision, but you can't adapt the skills, so the skill's going to fail. And so these are all interlinked. They're not same deal. You got to train it holistically. You cannot train it in a siloed serial fashion, because that's not how it's used.
That's not how it's used. Yes. So you went backwards from the real world scenario to identify the skills that they need to have, and then develop this continuous drills that have variability, and you basically push them to make decisions, essentially, and get familiar from the beginning, and get familiar with that process. How does it feel to make a decision in the middle of a fight, essentially, not just in the beginning, because it's always evolving, right? So that's an important aspect of the encounters, I think, in real life, this ever evolving nature. You can't just say, okay, this is this type of way. Maybe some calls may be simple, but there might always be a twist to the scenario. And so how do you adapt? How do you make decision? I think it's a really good idea to practice the skill of decision making, not just the skill of the skill.
Right.
All right, so you did this, and tell us a little bit about what you observed once you started implementing this program in the new recruits? What are the changes that you saw in their behavior and their performance?
Students who had no exposure to the old system
Mhm.
did quite well. And by that I mean in the first few days, because this was fairly isolated to defensive tactics. So we really hadn't started doing this globally and really culturally at the time. So it was a distinct way to train, which was met with some resistance by the students because they'd been given the things, right? They're not making decisions anymore. They're being given answers in some of these other forms. But in defensive tactics on the mats, now they have to do all these things. So there was a bit of a period of time that they needed, a day or two, in order to accommodate that, and they would tend to flourish. You would see what I would later call actual confidence, because the outcome was hooked to their ability to do, and not a theoretical thing. It's not what they, so with students who had been through the program, because we had returning officers from other disciplines, they didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. And the reason was it's a lot harder.
Yeah, a lot harder. Yeah.
There's a lot more involved. There's a lot more failure involved. And so what I'd start to see is a distinction between those who were coming in and didn't have to unlearn anything, and those who did. But none of that had anything to do with the physical skill. It was all the other components and perceptions and that kind of thing. That diminished over time, and even in a program. So they would have to participate, and they would start realizing this is harder than I thought it was, and this isn't learning 10 moves and being a ninja kind of thing. But I'm accomplishing things.
Yeah.
And we weren't giving that to them. They were doing that. It was the outcome, if they achieved it, was because they did the thing.
Right. You weren't rewarding them in a way. No, it was an internal reward, which is much more powerful.
The outcome's the reward.
Yep. So that's really fascinating. And just to add a note, NeuroSmart did a little bit of a pilot work with the Academy, and we actually have some really interesting results with this type of training, which seemed to indicate, these are preliminary, but seem to indicate that this type of training actually does improve stress regulation of the recruits over time, which is really interesting, because not all training does. It's just because people know the skills does not mean they're regulating themselves well, because if the skill is tied to the scenario, they don't feel as confident, like you said, about it, and that definitely keeps the stress level high. So we did see better stress regulation. We also saw something interesting, which is that the stress levels between the recruits became more uniform. So they started all over the place. Some were very stressed, some were not stressed at all. And at the end, everybody was kind of responding to the scenario in a very similar way. Suggestive, of course, we can only infer a similar thinking pattern or confidence level that came with the training. So maybe it's an indirect measure of effectiveness of training, I would say. So I want to ask Jesse about, so you did talk, when we were talking, you did talk about the emotional piece and the emotional adaptation, how that plays into it. Is there a way that how do you induce emotion in your drills, and how do you teach mitigation, or how do you assess somebody's mitigation?
Well, the assessment piece is where you come in, at least in modern era. The role of emotion and emotion negatively affecting performance is something that's been known in law enforcement forever, and we have all kinds of legends and stuff about how we fix that, as did we for a very long time. What I found is twofold. One, you don't have to induce the same level of emotion that happens in the live environment in order to train an emotional context. And two, what I found is the more we switch things from a theoretical process-oriented training to an outcome-based training where the student was responsible for things, the more it naturally induced emotion. And it wasn't the I'm afraid of dying emotion. It was similar though. I don't want to fail. I don't want to. I need to be successful. On the mats, it's the same thing. Somebody's going to hit me. No, they're not going to hit me as hard as the live environment, but this is not going to be pleasant, and that invokes the emotion. And so one of the strategies that we used a lot was to make sure that we had things in place. The training was, I'll call it, intense enough that it was invoking a proper level of emotion, and then a strict expectation and requirement of not acting upon that emotion, especially in the beginning. You're required to control the amount of pressure, for instance, that you deliver on a strike. You are required to respond in a legally reasonable way. And we wouldn't make those pieces complex. We'd make them actually very, very simple because they're dealing with the emotional component. And so those were some basic mitigation techniques that we were using early on. And what we found is as people began to work in those environments more, they didn't become more comfortable with failure. That was a common observation. They're never comfortable with it, but they could work in it. They could work with that risk. And you would see them act more freely, I would call it. Not necessarily take more risk, that's the wrong word, but they would act more freely, and they were more cognitive. They didn't have the same, it appeared they didn't have the same emotion. That's one of the reasons when we first talked, I was really excited, because is it true that we were actually decreasing the intensity of the emotion, or were we causing a shift, a cognitive, a shift from internal to external? And I think it's really important to know, because if you don't know that, you don't know how to gear your training. What I've learned and what we now really incorporate is I don't want to do training that simply tries to dull the emotion away, because that's not representative of a live environment. So what I would expect a student who's been through desensitization type training to have happen in the live environment, when they have that intense emotion, they're not going to be able to act, because the training was supposed to take care of that and it didn't. So I want to make sure that the perception of risk is accurate, but that, to that degree, the emotion may not be as intense. I thought this was a really bad monster, but it turns out it's just a little monster. Okay. But then as soon as we get to that point, it's almost like schema. As soon as we get to that point, then the rest of the work is about their perception of ability to mitigate that risk. And so the training is designed to keep the monster at what it's supposed to be. They're accurate in their perception of that, and then make them work over and over and over again on ways that they overcome that. And over time, then it's. I don't think the emotion's any less. We still see it. We don't see the effects of it. We don't see the cognitive impairment. We don't see even some of the physiological effects. We don't see the reactive hand shaking. We don't see the lips quivering. We don't see the hyper focus, physical hyper focus, right? I'm not turning my head. I'm not. We're not seeing those things anymore.
And so you see them in training.
Oh yeah. We used to see all kinds of stuff. It was very indicative of somebody that was in a state of emotion, what we would call emotional duress. They are now no longer in control. It's not just that they can't think cognitively. They are not acting on their own behalf currently.
That's really fascinating, and we did indeed see that in the the data we collected as well, right? That's our algorithms look for that red zone, or zone where we're not in a safe place cognitively to make good decisions, and the number of recruits that were in the red zone in the beginning dropped, and everybody was kind of in the same orange or green zone in the end. So definitely that correlates with your observations of less hyper-focused or handshaking behaviors indicative of unregulated stress. So that's really cool. So I always talk about this, and I think this is a great example of perception of threat and then perception of your ability, because what we describe as stress is if the external threat or the challenge is larger than your perception of your external threat is larger than the perception of your inner ability. So if you can modulate either of those things, I say perception, because again, if something could be really dangerous, if I'm not trained, like if I'm just a civilian and I see somebody with a gun and I already freak out, like that's enough for me, right? But as a police officer that's trained, perhaps, or with experience, that's maybe the perception is not that high to begin with of the threat, even though it is high. Of course, there's emotion, there's engagement, but and then how confident you feel in your ability to handle it is the other piece that will activate or not activate the stress response. If you feel confident, if you feel like you have the skills, which it seems like your kind of training for adaptation does give, then you're not going to activate that stress system as much, and it's not going to take over your action. So both of those things are really important here to be able to accurately assess the level of threat, and also having the internal tool, and confidence is a huge piece of it, to say I can do this, or I know what to do. So both of those things are very effective. We usually talk about, breathing and meditation and other techniques to self-regulate, which could be useful. But I think even more useful is the inner confidence to be able to deal with some things. Then you're not going to get to that level. Okay, very, very interesting. So I want to, we have about 5 minutes. I want to touch a little bit on your online learning activity, because I think you mentioned you changed that too, and you saw a really impressive improvement in the performance. So tell me a little bit about the changes of your online independent learning activity and the test structure. I think this was a detention officer basic class. And what did you change in the way that the class was taught, and what did you observe in the test?
Yeah, so we changed the structure for 2024. We've now had two and a half classes go through it. One peace officer basic, one detention officer basic, and we have another detention officer basic finishing up, and we're seeing it's replicating. But basically what we did is we tried to figure out, there were two of us. I was really interested in replicating environments. So when it comes to cognition and those kinds of things, we kind of divide the content into two things. We have information and we have principles, and the information is the thing that informs the decision, and the principle is the core of the decision. So for instance, probable cause is a principle, right? And you got to apply that based on information before you can say, is that probable cause or not? So that kind of idea. So I really attacked it that way. And then the cultural pieces of how many decisions can I get these people to make that are not fully informed, because that's probably the hardest piece of law enforcement, is you never have enough information. So that's where the pretest came from, so the structure is very simple. It's a pretest, and then they have an activity online where they have the same questions that they dealt with in the pretest, but now they have the requisite information to answer those kinds of things.
So the pretest comes before the learning. So they don't, at this point, they're not expected to know the answers.
No, they're not expected to know the answers, and they get very limited feedback on how they perform. They get to know whether the answer that they chose was right or wrong. They get to know whether they passed or failed the thing. They don't get numbers. They don't get percentages, which really they don't like, which is good. But then we go into this activity, and their expectation going in, as they've told me, is they expect to ace it, because now they have all the tools. And when they come to the realization, because they pass it, but they don't ace it, and that really, we think at this point we're actually conditioning a change in perception. That just having all the pieces does not mean that the outcome is assured, right? And so, but what it does is it seems to drive this explicit memory idea. They're recognizing later on, 2-3 weeks later, and in the cumulative up to 12 weeks later, they're recognizing complex answers, 3-4 answers to a question. These are all multiple choice or matching or ordering. But there's no stringed answers, anything like that. So these are very difficult and comparatively, and they're randomized. So you can't memorize. It's not a physical pattern they're memorizing. And yet they're recognizing these things, and we're also seeing some translation then into the use in the physical realm. So we're really excited about that, because that's where we're trying to get to, is just like with the physical skills, the defensive tactics is just a skill set. It's got to be used in the context of work. Well, so is all the knowledge. It's used to make decisions, assess things, and make decisions in the environment. So it's really of no good if they just pass tests. That's not where we need to be. But we were seeing that translation, same deal, that comfort level in being able to look at a circumstance and say, I know what that is, and here's what I'm going to do. And so we're taking actually some additional steps. I don't know when we're going to launch it, to specifically measure that. We measure it indirectly right now through competencies, but I want to get some really specific decisions based on specific cues. Can they catch the cue? Can they correlate that with the decision, and can they make the decision in the environment, not in
the written format?
Yeah. So we're really excited about it. They're talking about anywhere from 10 to 14 points higher on average than the traditional online learning stuff. Or excuse me, they're tracking 10 to 14 points higher than the lecture-based stuff. Most of the stuff used to be lecture. The other interesting side note is when you talk from a decision standpoint or interaction standpoint, in the lecture format, Peace Officer Basic had 1,400 interactions throughout a basic, 1,400 decisions to make academically. Now they have 8,800.
Okay.
So a lot more practice making decisions.
Yeah. I think that's the theme of the change. Would you agree that
Yeah.
you meant it is more practice in decision making?
Active learning. Active. Yes. And awareness of the consequences of those decisions, and awareness of the recognition piece is equally. I believe recognition is a skill set, decision making is a skill set, and adaptation those are all three skill sets that have to be developed in conjunction with what they're learning, or how they're going to use those. And that's what we weren't doing in the past.
Yes.
That we presumed that those skill sets were there, and we presumed that, for instance, adaptation was just a general skill set that applied to everything, and that's not true. That's not how that works. So, and the same with recognition and decision making.
Yeah, you have to create the schemas, and you have to practice those skills separately and the knowledge. Yeah, I think that's a great. I just want to summarize kind of the written portion, and then we'll wrap up. But so you implemented a pretest that has been shown, I think, with studies that you shared with me, to actually improve performance on the subsequent learning, which is interesting. And I think the fact that you don't give them the right answer, but you just tell them they're right or wrong in the pretest probably keeps them hungry to learn. And so there's an emotional motivation piece there that you introduced. The doing well but not acing component, just because it's passing is such a goal in traditional learning. I passed, but telling them that's not, that they're not acing it and not meeting the expectation, definitely, how our brains always predict things, and if things happen the way that we predicted, we don't learn, we don't take that additional information, because that's just how the brain is. It's okay, I already know that, so what I predicted has happened this way, ignore. It only learns and pays attention if what happens is different than predicted. So you actually introduce that into the structure, so that's important. And also we talked about multiple choice as opposed to yes or no, true false formats, which has been shown in studies that, like you shared, that, and we can link in the comments here, to enhance learning, because it actually makes the learner think about the wrong option and therefore retain that information as well as the right option. So all of these changes led to a 10 to 14 points improvement in the performance of the recruits. This is great. And also improvement in their application. All right. So, well, thank you so much, Jesse. We always talk and we have very long conversations. So, I always enjoy talking with you.
Likewise.
This was a very fun
Yeah.
recording, and I hope to continue to work with you in the future. Do you have any? Is there a way that the listeners can contact you directly, or you want me to link it in the chat?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, feel free to put my email
Okay.
in the chat as well, and yeah, more than happy to visit with anybody and share what we know and what we don't know, what we're still learning.
Awesome.
We're still on a road, so
Yes, for sure. And Jesse's contact will be in the comments. Thank you, guys. I thank you, Jesse. Sorry.
good.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.